Peter Zeihan, one of my favorites and one of the best in the business, just made a video explaining what's going on between Russia and Israel. Because a few days ago, the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations came out swinging against Russia, basically saying, we're against you, we're pro-Ukraine, we're going to provide weapons to Ukraine. For the first time since this war started, the Israelis have taken a side. So far, they kind of tried to remain neutral, even though they're kind of, an ally to the United States, which was very odd. But now they finally aligned themselves with Ukraine, anti-Russia. Now, Peter Zeihan made a great video explaining what's going on, what led to this, and why this is happening, but he missed out a few key points which I want to add in this video, which I think will make his analysis even better. Not that it's bad right now, but with what I add here, it's going to complete full circle the entire puzzle for you.
And the news today is that Israel's ambassador to the United Nations has announced that because of ongoing Russian changes in policy both in Ukraine and the Middle East, Israel is going to start providing a degree of military aid to the Ukrainians to help fight off the Russians. Specifically, he says that early warning radars are now being shipped to Ukraine so Ukraine can get some advanced notice of when missiles and drones are incoming.
I think he made a great recap, basically talking about how Israel and Russia were never really friends.
Israel and Moscow, and I say Moscow to include the Soviet system, have had a non-standard relationship for most of the last 75 years. The Russians/Soviets have tended to favor supporting the Arabs against the Israelis.
And that's true because Russians have always viewed Israel as kind of the proxy of the United States. Whether that is true or not doesn't matter, because that was always the understanding in Moscow that, Israel is just, the long arm of the United States in the Middle East and should be treated accordingly. However, what I think Peter Zeihan forgot to mention to you, which I'm sure he knows, is that Russia actually used to be one of the greatest friends of the Israelis back in 1948, all the way to the beginning of the 60s when Israel decided to align itself with the United States, and that is where the crisis started. So initially, Russia and Israel were kind of cozy, but of course, that didn't last. And ever since that point, Russia and Israel always kept it cordial, but the relationship was ruined and Israel and Russia was never friends. However, what Peter Zeihan actually did not mention here, and I'm sure he knows, is that Russia went beyond just being friendly with the enemies of the Israelis. They've actually created the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and Yasser Arafat, and the entire Palestinian movement, the flag, the creed, the whole thing was a KGB creation, a USSR creation to ram the United States in the Middle East. The whole Palestinian cause was an all-Russian playbook. The KGB did it with the Bolivians and with the Colombians, and the same model was applied for the Palestinians. They dug up Yasser Arafat out of Egypt. He was a middle-class guy. They rewrote his entire origin story, etc., etc. The entire voting over the creation of the PLO happened in Moscow, etc., etc. A lot of this stuff is known to people like Peter Zeihan, but not very widely known to the public. Now, it's ancient history, but it's well documented. Go Google it. A guy by the name of Pasepa out of Romania, one of the highest KGB officers in existence, and the second-hand man of Ceausescu, actually defected to the West and told about how he was paying off Arafat $200,000 a week, how he was training him, how they created the whole story in order to create hatred for the United States. The playbook was basically, let's create the United States image as being a colonialist invading force in the Middle East, and let's use the Israelis as a battering ram to make it happen, etc., etc. However, despite this being ancient history, it is still very critical to understand how Russia did not just support from afar anti-Israeli forces. In fact, it flamed them, it created them, and it basically operated them by remote control in order to screw with the US policy in the Middle East. It also goes to show you how the Israelis were always a peon, much like the Palestinians, in the larger chess game that's going on, which is kind of sad, but always the people who pay the price are the little civilians, while the big bosses, they play above ground. Now, the second part he talks about is why this relationship is changing now of all times. Why not a year ago? Why not 2 years ago? Why are the Israelis coming out against Russia now of all times?
The two governments have always had a degree of grudging respect towards one another, and as such, they share information, especially things like tax evasion information, on activities of the Russian oligarchs who oftentimes have dual citizenship in Israel. And this has encouraged the Russians to kind of go softly when talking with anyone who happens to be an outright foe of Israel. So the Israelis kind of turn a blind eye when the Russians are talking to the Iranians about things that are relatively ethereal and don't affect the Middle East directly. But this seems to have now changed with the Ukraine war. The Russians are involved in a military conflict that they see as existential. And that means a lot of these softly relationships that the Moscow folks have with other countries are secondary at best. And so the Russians have started inviting groups like the Houthis, which had no international platform prior, to Moscow to talk about strategy. And in this week, the Hamas group is actually going to be in Moscow for the same reason. And for the Israelis, this is not a minor issue. This is an existential issue for them.
It's 100% true. However, it's missing one key element. While the Iranian-Russian kind of kumbaya party definitely pisses the Israelis off 100%, and it does forces the Kremlin and Putin to be way more friendly to Hamas and the Houthis than they ever intended to, including inviting them to Moscow, etc., much more public with their support to these terrorists. However, that is not the reason the Israelis are pulling the plug on the whole Russian friendliness facade. The reason is much more nuanced than that. It's complex, and it has a second part that Peter Zeihan did not mention. Now, that second part that adds to it is that the Israelis have basically been always friendly with the Russians because they had an interest in doing so. When the Russians got involved in Syria, which shares the northern border with Israel and basically controls Lebanon and Hezbollah, and when the Russians basically operated massive air force and anti-air force units in Syria, that meant that the Israelis had to be very careful because the Israelis operate in those regions regularly, smashing Hezbollah, smashing the Iranians, smashing a lot of stuff in Syria. So that coordination between the Russians and the Israelis in Syria were very beneficial for the Israelis because essentially the Israelis told the Russians, look, we don't want to interfere with whatever you guys doing there. We just want to smash Hezbollah. If by any chance it kind of boils over towards Syria, we'll be careful. We're not going to screw with your interests. And the Russians agreed because that made perfect sense. The Israelis did their thing, the Russians did their thing, and they never crossed paths. That coordination basically warranted an above ground, cordial relationship. But as Ukraine got heated up and as the Russians basically moved a lot of their assets out of Syria, a lot of their focus, a lot of their resources out of Syria to Ukraine, the whole Syria coordination with Russia basically became irrelevant. More so when the whole Hezbollah thing is now existentially threatening Israel, and now they don't care about if Russians are getting pissed off by them bombing in Iran or not. So the whole facade is falling off not just because the Russians are now friendly with Hamas, it's because Syria is no longer a point where they have to play nice. So that's the second part of that explanation that kind of was missing for Peter Zeihan's recap, which was excellent, by the way. And the final piece I want to add here is about the Iron Dome system. Now, Peter Zeihan did a great recap of how great the Iron Dome system have proven to be, and he actually got it absolutely right. But he also kind of said that they might be thinking of providing the Iron Dome systems from the Israelis to Ukraine. And while that may be possible, that would be highly unlikely. And here's why.
We don't know exactly what systems, and we have no reason to believe at the moment that this is the Iron Dome system, which is world-renowned. The Iron Dome is a combination of radar and interceptor system that is designed to hit short-range ballistic missiles and drones, and especially swarms of both of them. And it has been broadly successful at protecting the Israeli population when Hamas and groups like it launched not just dozens, but hundreds of projectiles and missiles and drones into Israeli civilian areas.
It's a very expensive and elaborate system. It's actually manufactured by the United States and Israel jointly, and the Israelis would love to have 5 or 6 more units like this, at least, to deploy over there in Israel. Also, the Israelis are stockpiling right now the interceptor missiles because they're prepping for potential war with Hezbollah in the north, so they're not going to give any assets away. Whatever manufacturing capacity the Israelis and the United States have right now to basically make these Iron Dome interceptors and the radars, it's all going to go to Israel because the Israelis simply don't have enough of it. Now, if the United States decides, and they're 50-50 partners on this with the Israelis, and that's something that Peter Zeihan forgot to mention, it's not an Israeli project. It is a full partnership with the United States. So the United States can, with coordination with Israel, decide to go full ham on this and manufacture massively and basically provide this thing to Ukraine. Sure. So if the United States theoretically makes this a priority and decides to put on all its weight behind this, it would be possible, but we're talking about massive amounts of interceptors and radars. Ukraine is vastly bigger than Israel, and even right now, the Israelis don't have enough of them for that little piece of land they got over there in the Middle East. So This may be possible, but highly unlikely. Don't see that happening. Probably talking about more of radar system, more of old school stuff they have over there, basically warning systems, stuff like that. But who knows at this point? Now, remember who told you months ago that this whole thing is connected? When I was talking about how the Gaza war is connected with the Ukraine war and how this whole thing is a part of the huge chess game that's going on right now, and people are saying, well, Tom, you're just a fear-mongering crazy. What just happened right now proves to you that this wasn't. In fact, the alliances are now getting revealed to the greater public. And as that happens, with recent comments about NATO troops in Ukraine and potential nuclear retaliation by Russia, which I hope is just a crazy talk, and with the Moldovan breakaway Republic of Transnistria asking for Russian help against the Russian people who are being oppressed by Moldova, which is a video I'm just going to post on Patreon for the members and the subscribers. Thank you so much for supporting the channel, patreon.com/TomAshReport. If you'd like to watch that video, head on over to our Patreon. It's going to be uploaded in the next 24 hours. So with this whole development, with another breakaway republic in Moldova asking for Russian help, with the Russians threatening nuclear retaliation, with NATO talking about troops in Ukraine, the risk of World War III becomes greater, which is a horrible scenario to think about, but nevertheless part of reality.